Welcome, everybody, to the podcast for the Traveller in the Evening. This is Andy Wilson, as usual, speaking for the Traveller in the Evening, and I'm delighted to have with me tonight as my guest Mark Vernon, who I know from what I call the Blakeosphere, a general Blake milieu of academics, non-academics, crazy enthusiasts, all kinds of people. And Mark crops up there regularly in various guises, but for me, most importantly, he gave a meeting to the Blake Society a few months ago on Blake's Christianity and its relationship to his idea of the imagination. And I thought it was such an important meeting because of the controversy about Blake's religion, which sounds, it's an amazing thing to say, really, that it could be a controversial topic because Blake didn't have any doubts about it at all. But since Blake's time, he's been described as all kinds of things. So before we kick into that, I'll just say that Mark's the author of a number of very significant-looking books. I can't claim to have read any of them yet, although I ordered a copy of your book on Dante a couple of days ago, and I'm waiting for that to arrive, so I'm quite excited about that. And the other book I particularly want to mention, you're going to have to remind me of the title, Mark, but it's a book about Owen Barfield, who I'm very fond of. He's one of the Inklings with Lewis and so on. And I've never been fond of the Inklings, but when I read Owen Barfield, I got quite excited, the acceptable face of the Inklings or something like that. But what I'd like to do, Mark, is to kick off by asking you, if you wouldn't mind, reprising some of what you said to the Blake Society about the role of Christianity in Blake's work, and then we can take it from there in terms of, the different interpretations that have been put on that.
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me on. The Barfield book is called A Secret History of Christianity, and it's an account of Christianity from Owen Barfield's point of view, from his insights. And he has, I think, a particularly telling way of understanding the figure of Jesus, which actually really helped me in terms of my sense of Christianity. And then, yeah, you mentioned my Dante book. That's the subtitle is A Guide for the Spiritual Journey, and that's very much about what happened to Dante during this journey that he relates famously in the Divine Comedy, and what that might mean to us now. And I'm very interested in what these prophetic writers, what their relevance is to us now. And not just in terms of studying them, although there's great value in studying them, but learning from them as well. As Blake would say, he's a prophet, and that means he wants to touch us and our times now. And I think that, coming back to your question, this is where his Christianity is actually really important, because the nub of it for me is that Blake, I think probably throughout his life, but certainly in the latter parts of his life, came to the conclusion that the modern world was under the growing delusion that it could somehow save itself, that humanity was self-contained in a closed system cosmos. The imagination, for example, was just this rather strange faculty that we have to throw out beams of light across an otherwise dead world, and that we must use our reason, use our science in order to make life right for us. But in a very inward-looking way. And it was known as deism in Barfield's time. It's really become mainstream, in Blake's time, deism in Blake's time, it's really become sort of the default atheism of our times now. And Blake realised that, well, in a way, at two levels. One was, this was sort of false. And the reason why he thought it was false was because he realised that we live in a universe where, for example, it's not that we have imagination, it's that the imagination has us. And that's why we find life and the world and the cosmos and so on effectively infinite. There's a never-ending unfolding of wonder and interest and engagement and participation with the world around us. And that's because the world is not a closed system, it's an open system. As he says in one of his earliest publications, there's no natural religion. If that weren't the case, then life would just be experienced as a kind of dull round and would spiral into a sense of the void or emptiness or nihilism. And of course, that's precisely what's happening 200 years on after Blake's death, because the assumption is made that the world is this machine rather than this open expanse, alive organism. And Barfield wanted to challenge that both at the conceptual level, but also for personal reasons, because of the knock-on effects it would have on people, draining the meaning from life. And so it would lead to the anxiety, the depression, the possessiveness, the fear, the warring, and so on. That, of course, we do also see. This little book he published, There Is No Natural Religion, sort of nails it on the head. Natural religion is the understanding of religion as springing from what we would now call evolutionary processes. I mean, of course, Blake lives before Darwin, so he didn't have a developed sense of evolution, since post-Darwinian ideas. But nonetheless, the idea amongst the deists was that religion was a kind of naturalistic phenomena based on reason, based on empirical evidence, and so on. And he wanted to very much challenge that and say, no, it's prophetic and poetic, are Blake's words. And poetic means that it's the divine working within us, and prophetic means that we can articulate it and grow into it through the imagination as well. And so this was very much his sense of what Christianity was. Christianity, at the heart of Christianity, is the notion that a God-man, Jesus, incarnated in history, but in the more mystical interpretations of Christianity as well, that's not a one-off event that happened 2,000 years ago, but it's an ongoing, continuous event in all human souls, in fact. It's an account of our anthropology, who we are as human beings, that we can know ourselves as part of the human form divine, because that's what's been shown to us through Christianity in the figure of Jesus. And so Jesus becomes, in Blake, both a figure that appears to tell, say, Albion in the poem Jerusalem, the Emanation of the Giant Albion, that God is not far off, God is a brother and a friend, and that we dwell in God and God dwells in us. But also becomes a kind of symbol towards which Blake is imaginatively drawn, because it draws out his humanity to its fullest extent as well. And this is actually very standard mystical Christianity. Another really important plate, I think, from this early work, There's No Natural Religion, is the concluding one, where Blake summarizes Christianity and says, therefore God becomes as we are, that we may be as he is. God becomes as we are, that we may be as he is. And again, this was a sort of almost like a saying that the great teachers of Christianity in the early centuries of Christianity used repeatedly. It's not at all unusual, but it's particularly got forgotten since the Reformation, where mystical Christianity, for one reason or another, has sort of fallen out of the mainstream. And in its place, first of all, came deism, and now came atheism. And so even though Blake couldn't be more explicit, he wrote a book called There Is No Natural Religion, there's this sense that maybe we need to interpret that in some sort of literary way or postmodern way, or maybe it's a sort of a gesture of the imagination, and somehow we sort of conjure something that's a bit godlike within us. That's become one pole of reading Blake, rather than what seems to me to be really very evident in Blake, that no, he's saying we need to restore this sense of what Christianity is, if we're to address the predicament that we find ourselves in his time, the sort of early days of nihilism. The word nihilism was coined in Blake's lifetime, and now it's become a sort of fully fledged cultural assumption.
I mean, that's a fascinating way into the discussion. And I guess, were you to put that to an atheist or secularist, they say that, we've heard this before, Blake represents the past, a religious mentality which we have socially transcended and moved beyond. And therefore, one attitude to Blake, from that point of view, could just be to see him as, an interesting historical character with some interesting things to say that may or may not be possibly be related to religious dissent, political dissent, and so on. But it essentially would be to tame him and turn him into an historical curio. But a remarkable thing among Blakeans, I find, is just how much enthusiasm there is for Blake, and not just to understand what he said, but to very much identify with it, which creates this interesting paradox, because none of us in the Blake world are immune to this large scale social transformation toward the secular and secular explanations. So what does that mean for our appreciation of Blake? And I think that one thing that has tended to happen is that people maintain the kind of awareness that Blake was a remarkable singular figure that representing all kinds of things, but combining that with a modern interpretation of a modern translation of what he's saying. So people can be quite happily Blakean and at one level register, the centrality, when you said that there is no natural religion, one of his first works, I find that a really key work of Blake's, as terse and short as it is. It really lays down some of his key principles, and those principles are that he rejects the natural really in favour of the supernatural. Without the supernatural, there's no religion. The temptation, though, is for modern people to take what he said and give that a natural interpretation. So you said, before we started recording, Mark, you said to me, don't make the introduction, and describe me too long, Andy. It gets boring for the readers. But I really should have included the observation that you yourself were an Anglican priest, and that you originally trained as an Anglican priest, and then gave that up in order to move into psychotherapy, and so on. But you clearly yourself managed to combine the kind of all the insights of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy and so on with a religious view. But lots of other people don't. So they interpret Blake's mythos, for example, as very often as kind of displaying a series of Jungian archetypes, which then interrelate to each other, and we can use that in therapy. I spoke to a chap a couple of months ago on one of the podcasts who's written a book about Blake's book, illustrations to the book of Job, and Jungian psychotherapy and all kinds of other things. So that's one way to reposition Blake. But in that, we precisely lose the transcendent. I want to throw that back at you, if you like, and ask you to comment on the different aspects of Blake's Christianity. You spoke about the imagination. I'd like to return to that. But there are the questions of, was Blake a mystic? It's normal to call him a mystic. Was he, very common these days to call him a Gnostic? I think the idea being that, sort of the acceptable face of Christianity these days, because the Gnostics are considered terrible heretics, and that's very exciting. But the notion is that the Gnostics rejected the material world in favour of a spiritual world which was wholly other. And people see that in Blake, which I admit that when I first read Blake, and having read a little bit about Gnosticism, that was one of the first things that occurred to me. But of course, that's not Blake's position. But as I say, other people take that a lot further, and I wanted to refer to the recent book by John Higgs, William Blake versus the World. It was published a few years ago, which in Higgs's analysis of Blake, he sort of goes as far to say that, I think the only thing he's sure about in religious terms, Higgs, is that Blake wasn't a Christian. He definitely wasn't a Christian, but it's the one thing he's sure about. He considers the possibility that Blake was a Taoist, that he was a Buddhist, that he was Hindu, and I think he eventually decides that he was a humanist, because he saw humanity as the key to everything. But he calls him a divine humanist because he apparently combined that with divine aspects. I don't know how you have divine aspects without the actual divine, but that really is beyond my comprehension. But in any case, there's that jumble of thoughts about Blake. Let me throw that back at you and say, how would you position Blake, not only in terms of his original ideas in religion, but their relation to other ideas, and obviously in the first case, principally other ideas about Christianity? Was he a terrible heretic or what?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that makes a difference to me is that Blake was not an isolated visionary, and he's not translatable to me to being a kind of eccentric visionary now who can somehow, like the patron saint of the humanist imagination, whose wild ideas are a bit wild for us now, but nonetheless the very wildness somehow inspires our humanistic attempts to, inject life into an otherwise dead cosmos. Blake was deeply connected with his times and was a very profound critic of his times intellectually. He read Newton, he read John Locke, he read Francis Bacon, he read others, and he didn't write great treatises as critique, but wrote very pithy, couplets and quatrains and summaries, like this little booklet, There's No Natural Religion, which get to the heart of what was unfolding as the modern philosophy, and say it won't do. And it's not that it won't do just because it's not Christian or something. It won't do for our humanity. It's cutting down who we are as human beings. The reason why human beings are a mystery to themselves is because at the heart of us is a kind of infinite depth and eternity. And Blake's whole impulse is to cleanse the doors of perception, to see everything as it is, infinite. And so if you say, well, it's not really infinite, it just kind of looks like that because we endlessly play around with ideas or, put two and two together and make more than four or whatever it might be, it's deeply demoralizing. It's saying it's all just a sort of fancy or a fake or a delusion that maybe we poor human beings need to kind of keep the embers of meaning alive, but really they're just sort of dying out and declining. And I think 200 years on, it's quite clear that many people, this sort of struggle to somehow make meaning rather than discover meaning is failing. And I think you can even relate it to the ecological crisis and so on. If you don't experience the cosmos and nature as replete with the divine as you are yourself, and so it's almost like one depth speaking to another depth, then, for most of social engagement with nature, it gets instrumentalized and the world becomes a kind of resource to use and to use up. It's not about relating to a wider world. So the reason why I think that holding on to what Blake actually thought and wrestling with it is challenging. I'm not saying it's straightforward, and it's certainly not. It's less straightforward even than it was in the Deist day, because we have got this couple of hundred years of, deepening atheism. But nonetheless, Blake's critique is, if you don't try and wrestle with that, then it's just going to continue to spiral down. And you can, make as many gestures as you like to a kind of postmodern inventiveness. But most people see through that. It's really just a few academics who've got the sort of luxury to play around with the footnotes that can do that. But for most human beings, it's become an existential crisis. I think certainly in the West, anyway. That's one factor, and why I think this really actually matters. Another thing is, relating to this idea of Gnosticism. So on. I mean, I like what you say about how Gnosticism, because it is sort of deemed heretical, has become an acceptable face of religiosity. I mean, the truth actually is that the real Gnostics in the ancient world were, rather unpalatable people, mostly because they hated bodies and they hated so much of what we value now. Certainly the whole, the material side of life, and they led very ascetic existences in some sort of bid to escape it altogether, like you were saying. But I think, this word gnosis really in the Greek just means knowledge. And Blake is a Gnostic in that more particular sense, because he thinks that through the imagination in particular, but also our reason, we can know of the divine presence. We can know of the human form divine. And, a great poem like Jerusalem, the Emanation of the Giant Albion, is repeated attempts for the divine saviour, as Blake often puts, or even the Heavenly Father speaks at one point in Jerusalem, to reach out to us in our distressed state. Albion sort of dies again and falls on the rock of ages. And then Jesus, the divine saviour, appears and tries to breathe life back into Albion. And eventually, through Jerusalem combining with Vala being nature in its sort of depleted sense, Jerusalem being the divine spirit, re-entering nature, becoming Britannia, and then Britannia moves through Albion's breast and gradually awakens, and then Albion realizes that his friend Los was always the divine spirit, and so sees Los and Jesus as one. And then Albion throws himself into the furnaces of affliction, that which seems so ghastly, but they turn into fountains of living water. And that's, broadly, the kind of redemption that Blake understands. And of course, this is this is an imaginative act, not just in sense of some sort of symbolism that can somehow speak to us, but it's actually a map for the life that we can undergo by becoming receptive once more to this wider participation, receiving that through intuition and imagination, and knowing our lives, therefore, to be part of this great unfolding. I think that that's very much the message that Blake has, and it's a kind of gnosis because it is a knowing, it's a felt knowing, really, rather than an intellectual knowing. Although then reason, can help discern and make sense of that. So again, at the end of Jerusalem, the Illumination of the Giant Albion, Newton, Bacon, Newton, and Locke are seen joining hands with Shakespeare, Chaucer, and Milton, and the arrows of their intellects and so on are firing across the sky. And because at last reason has found its proper relationship to the imagination, which is to discern that which we receive through inspiration and intuition, not to try and set itself up as a sovereign, isolated unto itself that can somehow pin down everything through human effort, which of course is a sort of secular humanist approach. So look, that's sort of to riff a bit on some of Blake's imagery as well, but I hope that says something more about the vision that Blake held out for his times and for himself, but also, he's a prophet of our times. Many historians now would say that the Georgian period in which Blake lived was the sort of laid the seeds for modernity as it's become. So the Georgian period is not an olden times now cut off from ours. It's the beginnings of our times. And Blake's genius, his visionary capacity, was to see what was unfolding, but maybe because it hadn't yet completely enveloped the world in the way that it has now, he could speak to that. And by returning to him now, and we see what's gone on in our times, and so can resist it in one moment, but also feel the hope, feel the energy, feel the breath of Jerusalem coming back to us now as well.
Yeah, there's a curious thing about Blake, which is that he says several times, but he's recorded as saying that to him the Bible is everything. Really, it's the big, the alpha and omega of his world. So he was extremely much better read than people generally allow, as you say. But all of his reading was in support of his understanding of what he gleaned from the Bible. And when you think about that, it's quite a remarkable thing, because that was one of his proudest boasts about that. That's where I'm coming from, man. That's about the Bible. But at the time, the commentators, few though they were in Blake's time, but the commentators nevertheless inherently saw him as a rather heretical, weird, eccentric Christian. And yet he saw himself absolutely as not at the centre of Christian tradition, because that would be to make a claim about history that he isn't making. But he does see himself as at the centre of the Christian experience, the experience of the imagination, like as expressed in the Bible. So what's peculiar is we've gone from a situation in which Blake's Christianity was doubted by his original supporters, because he was seen as being a very eccentric Christian, despite his belief that, Christianity was the kind of orthodoxy was at the centre of his belief. He just thought that other people were the heretics, not him, which is a valid point of view, But we've gone from that to today, where people go as far as, rejecting Blake's Christianity at all. And they do that in a kind of secular mood, in the sense of saying, well, obviously Blake is saying something interesting, but as we now understand it, what he's really talking about is, whatever it is they think he's really talking about. So there's been that shift, but common throughout is this denigration of Blake's status as a Christian. And I think there's a couple of things about that I'd like to add. One is that what you said about the inadequacy of modern ways of experiencing and interpreting and being in the world, that they require this transcendental dimension, a religious dimension. I think that's a vitally important insight, and that's why Blake is so important today. He existed at the cusp of the creation of the modern and the transition into the truly modern age, which is what gave him his perspective, what makes his perspective so powerful, because he's applying that other way of seeing to this emerging new world that we still live in the aftermath of. But you drew attention as a consequence of that to two really vital points about Blake's relevance. One is that in ecology, for example, unless you see the rest of the world as somehow a product of the divine, then it's simply there for your manipulation, and there's no way of escaping that. And what that makes me think of is when I used to be in a Marxist activist group, right? And many years ago, probably, more than 30 years ago now, I was at a massive meeting in central London with thousands of people with these Marxist speakers. And one of the kind of leaders of this group thought it'd be funny to get up and say, he asked the audience, okay, how many people here are vegans? And a few people, hardy, brave ones, I think, put their hand up. And this was a long time ago, before being vegan has the cachet that it might have today, if it has any cachet. But it was seen in those circles then as extremely eccentric. So a few people put their hands up, and he made the joke. He said, well, go back to your own effing planet. What he said, ha ha ha. But what was interesting about it was that a sort of slightly wiser head intervened to as they used to say, then bend the stick back in the other direction and try and explain it. And what he said was, what we have to understand is that people who care about the environment and ecology, people who care about the tuna, right, in the North Sea, what they really care about is the quality of their drinking water. They know that it's polluted, so they worry about the tuna as a sort of proxy for worrying about themselves. And in hindsight, I find that so fascinating. And this chap saying this, the details don't matter, but he was the philosopher in the room. He was the intellectual leader of this group. And his way of interpreting ecology was, again, harnessing everything to the needs of humans. And that's a very Marxist point of view, which has difficulty in appreciating the world in and of itself. And I think that this, not just Christianity in general, but the Christianity that Blake finds and represents, is absolutely vital to recovering that ecological insight. And so when he talks about, the fly, for example, it's really strange. That poem has always had a huge effect on me, as slight a poem as it is. I'll put it in the notes to this meeting for people to read, because he basically, at some level, treats the fly as an equal being, a personality. And that's an extraordinary thing to do. And I know that once you accept that way of seeing the world, your attitude towards political questions changes, quite apart from any intellectual positions you might have had. The insight that you've gained by seeing the world in that Blakean way makes you much more attuned to ecological issues. I think that's a vital part of what you said a moment ago. It's very much there in the philosopher Timothy Morton's new book, which I sort of spoke to him for the Blake Society a couple of months ago and interviewed him. But he makes that a central point about ecological awareness, the need for Christianity, not just its relevance, but its direct relevance, and why we need a Christian view in order to address ecological questions properly. And the other thing, actually, that reminded me of that view, that in what you said, was about your comments on Gnosticism, because what Morton talked about was that flipping Gnosticism, seeing Blake as a flipped Gnosticist, not a Gnostic, because we invert the Gnostic rejection of the world in favour of spirit. To say, the way Morton put it was to say, we're not terrible bad bodies trapped in a spiritual universe, in bodies that make us sin. We live in a world of terrible ideas that stop us enjoying our bodies and our physical existence. So there's that inversion taking place. But I just want to say that those are reasons for taking Blake's Christianity extremely seriously and rescuing it when people try to undermine it. But the other aspect of that I'd like to go back to and throw back at you, because you spoke about the imagination, but it seems to me that when Blake talks about the imagination, or rather when people hear him talk about the imagination, they take that in a quite direct and empirical way to be about what we normally think of as the imagination, right? Works of art, things painted on a canvas and put on a wall, or music or something like that. But I think that Blake had a much more thoroughgoing idea of what the imagination was, and that it extended to every aspect of existence. In a sense, our perceptions, which the Locke and Hume and the empiricists was given to us by the outside world, which we then process it. But already all of our apparatus for having perceptions and things are a product of historical human imagination. And if we live in a maze today, politically, or in a labyrinth, partly it's a labyrinth of ideas that we've created, the history that we've created. And so to me, part of Blake's contribution is not just to centre the imaginative powers as we traditionally understand them, the imagination of the artist, but the imaginative powers as they exist in us as citizens and as, as members of a community, to the imagination as it exists in us that enables us to change that community and change our relations with one another, which puts us right back in your territory as a psychotherapist. So yeah, what do you make of those comments on imagination?
Yes, I mean, I think it's really important to realise that, like we're saying, really, the imagination is not a private human capacity that you have, that I have, that we can use to add colour to our lives. I mean, at one point, for example, Blake says nature is imagination itself. The whole world, the whole cosmos is a manifestation of the imagination. And we share in that wellspring bubbling up. Perhaps because of human capacities, we're able that bit more consciously to participate and even co-create with that wider imagination. But the whole of the world is an imaginative act. We dwell in the imagination. And, that's partly why Blake can also talk about Jesus, the imagination. And because, again, in the Christian understanding, Jesus is the manifestation of the Logos. And the Logos is this kind of creative principle. And so is this imaginative principle, this unfolding, this emanation from the divine. And so it fits in with that way. But I think this also relates back to what you're saying about Christianity and its response to the ecological crisis now. Maybe some parenthesis. I should, of course, say that there are good reasons why people don't turn to Christianity naturally when they're thinking about the ecological crisis, because there's another side to Christianity, this so-called dominion theology, which someone like Francis Bacon was very instrumental in popularizing, which is the idea that somehow the world's been given to us to exploit, or to manipulate and restore us to a kind of heavenly Eden. And then John Locke, another one of Blake's great enemies on Christian grounds, also said that the cosmos is worth nothing, the world is empty, unless human beings act on it. So John Locke, for example, coins the phrase a wasteland. And in particular, John Locke was looking across at the American territories in the British Empire at the time, and just seeing sort of vast expanse of unutilized land. And he said that's a wasteland unless we go and exploit it and use it. So that is another very strong strand within the Christian tradition, and is, for obvious reasons, partly why people don't think or even reject Christianity as a resource. But Blake's is this other possibility, which is seeing everything as an outpouring of the divine imagination, and recognizing that we're part of it, therefore. I mean, there's the very famous poem that he writes in a letter from Feltham, where he talks about, while sitting on the yellow sands of the sea, he sees the whole of the cosmos kind of come alive, and not just the sea and the sky, not just the creatures, but the rocks and the meteors and the clouds and the hills. And then he reaches the kind of climax with this thing and says, all were men seen afar. And what he means, he's using this word men with, I think, a mind to the root, which is like the same root as mental. So it's minded, it's imaginative. So when we experience the intelligence of our perceptions, realizing that it adds up, it has coherence, it has beauty, it calls us with its truthfulness and its goodness and so on, and that very expansive sense of intelligence and making sense of things, and that is precisely what the natural world is doing as well in its way. And so, we need the natural world in a way because it's part of our own intelligence, part of our own imagination, and we're less without it. But also, we're in relationship with it. And the human exception, which now has become a kind of negative sense, which you do get in deep ecology, the idea that somehow humans have become a parasite on nature in our exceptionalism. That's only possible. And when you see the natural world and humans becoming uncoupled or detached. But Blake is saying, no, we never are uncoupled or detached, but we do have a particular calling. We do have a particular vocation. And if we can learn to exercise that vocation aright, which is bringing our understanding to Blake would say, offering the articulation of that, which is a form of praise and celebration, which lifts it all back to the divine. And this is another part, I think, of Blake's understanding of what it is to be human. We are these sort of in-between creatures that have one head, one part of our imagination is in eternity and another part is in everyday existence, the minute particulars. But the reason why we can see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower is because we can bridge those polarities, those contraries. And so a huge, crucial part of our calling, which is also our satisfaction, is to articulate and celebrate that in poetry, in philosophy. And of course, Blake does that wonderfully in like in that poem, The Fly. The shock, as you're saying, of the fly is a jolt of awareness. Can we see what he's seeing? It's an invitation. Can we share in that perception somehow? And if we could, then we'd know of the fullness of the natural world, the human imagination, and the divine reality, which brings it all together. That's very much it. So, the poem The Fly is part of Blake's expression of Christianity quite as much as his direct references to Jesus and the Heavenly Father and so on.
Yeah, I think that people have a mistaken tendency to treat Blake as a theologian, and they're trying to weed out what exactly is he saying about God, and then let's compare that to what the Pope says or something like that, as if that was what he was doing. But as a prophet, I think he's doing something quite different. He's actually within. It's very hard for us to see even the Christian tradition as something other than a consumer item that we might consume. It never occurs to anybody that he might actually be within the Christian tradition, and like a prophet of old, he might not be telling you the theory of what God is like. He's just telling you what he can see of the divine, and I think that implies a very different relationship to the world, and it's one that's reflected in the Fly, I think, as you say. One thing, when I was a young undergraduate, in a philosophy undergraduate, I was quite taken with Francis Bacon's statement that nature to be commanded must be obeyed, which is the foundation of modern, empiricist science. It sounds quite humble, because it involves obeying nature. And it's only now that I see that really it contains an incredible veiled threat. It starts out nature to be commanded. That is the point of the operation of science, is to command nature, which does involve obeying it somewhat and following its laws. But the point is always to obey it. The way that you might obey, to command it. The way that you might command, your servants or slaves or lesser members of your family or something like that. And what I mean by saying that is that it seems to me that what Blake is bringing to the table that isn't there in some other Christianities, as you did, what did you call them there, Mark? What did you say, such and such Christianity? The one that says that nature exists for us to command and for us to use.
It's known as dominion theology now.
Dominion theology, right. It seems to me that dominion theology, what that has in common with Francis Bacon's attitude and the attitude of the empiricists and of the theists is this idea that the world consists of subjects and objects, and the job of objects is to be commanded and pushed around by subjects. And the subjects are, usually white men or imperialists, slave owners. So it's all about these hierarchical relationships. But Blake, by seeing for example, seeing animals not simply as junior members of our family, let's say, or things to which we have some duty of care, he actually sees them as personalities. And once you start going down that road, then you're looking at a universe of equals, things in which you are participant, not things to which you either have a responsibility to manipulate them or to consume them. You don't have a responsibility to do anything in particular with them. We are just there among all the rest. So it seems to me that's what's unique about his take. I don't mean he's the only person who has that take, but that is a unique take within Christianity. And I think the other takes aren't genuinely Christian. I think they're adaptations to prevailing ideology, particularly at the time you're talking about, the 18th, 19th century, when the British Empire was rising, and it was all about bringing wisdom to the other parts of the world, bringing culture, decency, the light of reason, and so on and so forth. I think Blake explodes all of that. But what it led me to think about, to ask you about, is that I noticed, so I know very little about Owen Barfield, for example, but what I gather, the little I do know, is that I liked reading him very much when I read him, and he in fact was one of the key turning points on my journey toward becoming a Christian, because I've been a Marxist, a materialist, and so on. I've loved Blake, but I interpreted him very much as maybe the way Thomas Althusser interpreted him, as a kind of atheistically, as a kind of atheist Christian. I think, by the way, that interpretation of Blake is a very smart one. I think the idea that Blake's Christianity was a kind of atheism is the closest you could get to convincing me that he was anything other than a Christian, because the idea that it was a different kind of religious thing is just nonsense. So the Althusser kind of idea I toyed with as being an intellectually acceptable way to be a Blakean, if you like, to be an atheist Christian. But it was reading Barfield that made me much more aware of, I think, something Blake was very aware of, which is that our culture is, in a sense, where we're at. We're a product of a Christian culture. It's no point in, again, visiting the supermarket of ideas and picking and choosing between being a Taoist or a Buddhist. I can be a Zen Buddhist or this Mahayana. I mean, what would you as a Western person like to consume as a religion? I think that's a fundamentally silly idea. And it was Barfield who convinced me about that and made me think about my relationship to the existing culture and look at the Christian roots of, even of our modern secularism has Christian roots. It's very much Christian in some ways. So, but what I don't know about Barfield is this wider picture that I believe you paint in your book about his idea of the evolution of consciousness. You mentioned evolution. So I'd like to throw that back at you, because I also understand from reading the blurb for your book on Dante that that's very much the theme of that book, is the transition points in consciousness. So you're sort of painting that picture across several books now. So, having discussed questions of Blake and religion generally, I'd like to invite you to explain something about those ideas about the evolution of consciousness, which presumably have something to do with Desjardins. Do they, or?
Yeah, they are different from Teilhard de Chardin, actually, but although, there is a sort of cluster of figures. John Gebser will be another one that have this sense of that by consciousness they mean that the perception and the experience that human beings have had of being themselves and alive in the world have changed radically over periods of cultural time. So, over millennia rather than over decades. And someone like Gebser or someone like maybe like Desjardins would have a sort of emergentist view, a sort of rather linear view that it begins in some sort of more primitive form and then gradually complexifies and reaches the point where we are now, and we can sort of see a richer, more transcendent possibility tomorrow, the new sphere, like in Desjardins. Barfield has a different idea, and I think Blake would be more Barfieldian, actually, which is that, no, it's that each period of time is its own distinct unfolding of the infinite. And so each period of time has its own genius, but it becomes incomprehensible to successive periods of time without use of the imagination. And where we are now is we look back in the past and we find inspiration in the past because it shines a spotlight on our deficiencies now, and so inspires us to rethink the present. And I think this was happening for Blake. You mentioned the empire there. It was a period when, say, indigenous Americans were coming to Europe, particularly coming to England, and actually rather challenging a lot of the ideas that existed about what civilization was and what freedom was and the role of money in society and these kind of elements, and challenging so as to make at least some people think maybe we've missed something here. We think that we are living in this progressive time, and of course, progress is another word that gets coined in Blake's age, and but maybe we've missed something out. And so when Blake, for example, in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, talks about talking with Ezekiel and Isaiah, which he does, so wonderfully, partly tongue in cheek, but partly seriously. I think it's Isaiah tells Blake, it was the indigenous Americans that had these ideas first, along with the Brahmins in India, and then we, the ancient Hebrews, picked them up, and now we're giving them to you. And what Blake's doing there, I think, is pointing out that different consciousnesses at different times have their own insights, and now we can receive those insights from what we might think of as more ancient, even more primitive cultures, because not to go back nostalgically, but because they've got something of a spirit that we need now to re-inject into our times. And so this is a different sort of sense of the evolution of consciousness. It's more the rather than a sort of linear line up. Barfield talked about a U shape, and the idea is that the U in its descent is coming down from the Aboriginal source, manifesting in its particularities of now, but then that particularity is a return back to the transcendent, to eternity, as Blake would have it. I think that's part. That's one of the things that's happened, that's lost this sense, is that which is transcendent has become uncoupled from that which is immanent. So maybe it's more natural for people to think as the transcendent as far off and distant, and the immanent as being that which is the only thing which we can have direct contact with. But Blake is, one of those people that realize that the finite is but a glimpse of the infinite, or time is what, as Plato puts it, is the moving image of eternity, or the minute particular has a fractal nature, as we would say now. It opens onto that which is transcendent, and that's again another way of saying that Blake was a mystical Christian or a visionary, that he realized that we human beings have a sense and taste for the infinite, as Friedrich Schleiermacher, another figure of that time, put it, and that it's in our finitude that we gain that sense of the infinite, which again is why everything matters. It's not that you can just sort of brush it all aside in pursuit of some abstract whole. No, it's in the very particularities of the world that exists around us that we discover the whole, and the two then are seen to come together. And Blake, Blake also gets this from the activities of the East India Company, another element here in the the colonial times. Blake is one of the first readers of the Bhagavad Gita that gets translated into English in the 1780s. And I think that the Bhagavad Gita is very influential actually on Blake. He was too early for Buddhism. Buddhism didn't really come into the West for another 100 years after that. But he certainly was deeply, I think, read in Hindu texts. And I think what he learns in the Bhagavad Gita is that there's a way of life that Krishna teaches to Arjuna, which is about offering moment by moment almost what you're doing back into this greater whole. It's sometimes talked about, acting without thought for the consequences. And it's the notion of sacrifice that Arjuna learns from Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. It's not sacrifice in the sense of trying to manipulate the gods or try to bring out a certain kind of income, a certain kind of outcome. And that's one of the things that the Bhagavad Gita is correcting. It's more receiving life and then offering it back, receiving life and offering it back. And it's in that, that breath of life, the in-breath and the out-breath, the receiving and then the offering back, that Krishna teaches Arjuna how to live well. And I think Blake was deeply influenced by that sense of sacrifice. And so the figure of Jesus is the one who descends and offers and then returns back to the divine. That pulse, therefore, of the sort of the U-shape from God back to God, is both the way that Blake conceives of the unfolding of history, but also even moment by moment. He has this wonderful expression in Milton where he says there's a moment in every day that Satan cannot find, nor can his watchfings find it, but the industrious find it. And this moment they multiply, for when it once is found, it renovates every moment of the day if rightly placed. And, you know, so this industriousness is Blake using a word that again became very current in the times. It meant materialist, progressive kind of industriousness, the dark satanic mills and all that. But Blake's saying, no, true industriousness is actually a spiritual reception and an offering back. And that moment when it's discovered, which is the length of a pulsation of an artery, he also says, and that's what renovates every moment of the day if rightly placed. This is the way that we must try and live. And he learns it from contact with texts like the Bhagavad Gita, from his experience of the natural world, which of course that pulse is very much felt when you live in the natural world and aware of these things. I think he gets it partly from these older cultures that British thinkers are coming into contact with because of the empire, but he knows it completely himself, and so expresses it in his poetry, because of course poetry too, the way of putting words together that has this living quality and that transmits this felt sense of things quite as much as tells you about it.
Yeah, the thing about the transcendent and seeing the transcendent, I think it's a huge thing in the appreciation of Blake, is that people mither about what it means by Blake's visions, you know, what it means to say that Blake had visions. So I've been to numerous meetings by people claiming that what Blake saw was because he suffered from a neurological condition, for example, hyperphantasia, which again, actually John Higgs talks about, but quite a few other people do too. And all these kind of explanations for what that vision is. And I think that's all rather bizarre, because, you know, it seems to me that there are plenty of people with hyperphantasia, but there's only one William Blake. And what William Blake brought to maybe he did have hyperphantasia, but that's not what his vision is. What he brought to all that was something that the way I would put it is to say that the secret to being able to have visions is to know when you're having visions. Because I think often we're having visions, but we have such a rationalized concept of what we are that we find them impossible usually to recognize for what they are. And without going into details, that is my experience. I remember once I was having this experience and I was thinking to myself, good gosh, I'm having an experience that's exactly like the spiritual experiences that spiritual people describe. And it took me a while to go, to think, well, that actually was a spiritual experience. I was able to recognize it. And I think that's one thing that is great in Blake, actually, is that he helps people understand what it's like. You know, when he says to see, eternity and a grain of sand and all that kind of thing, that gives people an idea of what it's like when they are, I won't say having visions, but on the cusp of having visions, or in that kind of territory, in the territory of the divine. I think that's a key thing in Blake. One thing I've got to say, however, Mark, because we're moving towards the end, is that I conceived of this meeting as a kind of being about, Blake's Christianity. What is the status of it? Why do people deny it? And all of that kind of thing. And I've come up with a sort of wacky title. I won't tell. It'll be a surprise. I've got a slightly wacky title for the meeting, but I want to make it plain to everybody that in sort of emphasising Blake's Christianity, the point isn't to say that, he could have been of another religion, but he found them not to be as interesting or as good or as relevant. That would be a completely inappropriate way of thinking about what's going on there. So Blake, like everyone he should be, was deeply immersed in other religions, what he knew of them. I know, for example, was it More's edition of, what's it called, More's The Hindu Pantheon, that I have a reproduction of an 1860 edition. I believe there was an early edition that Blake must have seen, or he must have seen part of it, because he reproduces an image of Kali as, given your interest in Dante, it's in one of the Dante illustrations. Is it supposed to be depicting what is Dis?
Yeah, so the Kali image he uses to model Lucifer.
Yeah.
In the pits of the Inferno, yeah.
Yeah, so he's deeply absorbent of all these other influences, and I want to make that plain that we're not here to we're here to big up Christianity. I think we can say that much, but not at the expense of other religions. Certainly at the expense of the idea that Blake wasn't a Christian.
No, I mean, Blake had this commodious view of Christianity. He believes in the one God, but the one God is everywhere. So you can't say, the one God's operating in Blighty, but not operating in India. That doesn't make any sense of the one God at all. But he's also, he believes it's in the particular, in the minute particular, that you discover the whole. And so by immersing yourself in the one, Christianity, you actually discover the truths of everything else as well. And so there can be this sort of dialogue, and the dialogue inspires your tradition by welcoming it in, and then relates back to other traditions as well. So again, that's very much this sort of pulsing dynamic. That's how it works.
And I think that's very much a view of religion as a living tradition. And I think, again, not to pick on John Higgs, although I don't mind doing that, bits of his book quite annoying. But one of the things he does when he says that Blake isn't a Christian, he does so, but I won't quote it, but he does so by constantly revisiting the idea that Blake's ideas were unorthodox according to modern doctrine. So that turns Christianity into a doctrine that's transmitted doctrinally, by hunting out heresy, maintaining the correct doctrine. But that's not the way that Blake saw religion. Blake saw the continuity of religion as a continuity of the imagination. We imaginatively appropriate tradition and we use it in order to do Christian things. That's again part of being, part of being a Christian isn't to just absorb or succumb isn't the right word, to genuflect towards the correct doctrine. It's to live a Christian life, and that's a life of the imagination. And that's what allowed Blake to say things like, to talk about the antediluvian, the ancient religion of these isles being Christian. That's just an absolute logical absurdity to a modern person, as it is to John Higgs. He says that. This is clearly absurd. So therefore, Blake can't be a Christian because it's not part of Christian doctrine that, that antediluvian Britain was participated in the original patriarchal tradition, or however it was put. So, we're talking about Blake as being a part of a living tradition of Christianity that transmits. I remember thinking, looking at some of the aspects of Blake's politics and the way that, for example, Edward Thompson relates them to dissenting movements in the English Civil War. And then later people said, well, they pointed out all these important differences. Thompson, for example, tries to harness all this to the modern Communist Party, as is his right. But, people get into an academic debate about what really did the dissenters stand for. But again, they miss the point that in politics, actually, as in religion, to appropriate a tradition is to reimagine it. You can't just keep reliving the past. So it's a perfectly valid thing to do. And in a way, I wish it weren't, because it would be easier to just quote the text to show that Blake was a Christian. But I think that's something that we have to establish all over again, what that Christianity meant. And I think many of the things you've been saying, Mark, will help us do that. So I'd like to wrap up the meeting really by inviting you if you have any final remarks. But I do want to. I will be reading the Dante book next, very much from this kind of Barfield point of view. It sounds like an exciting way to think about Dante. It's a very hefty book as well. It's massive, 500 pages. So I'm looking forward to burying myself in it in the weeks.
It's a guide canto by canto, and there's 100 cantos, so hence the size of it. But yeah, I mean, look, I think there is a reason to criticise Christianity myself, and Blake tells us what that reason is. And we've mentioned already about this dominion theology and so on. But another thing that was very prevalent in his time, and is still very prevalent now, is the reduction of Christianity to a moral creed. And Blake talks about the wastes of moral law. And this, again, is a deistic move that now has become a kind of cultural Christianity move, that we need somehow Christianity to prop up Western civilization, because only then do we have the values and the moral rigor that we require, maybe even to fight the perceived enemies of Western civilization. This is the kind of thing you hear now. Blake would have been absolutely horrified about that. It's a legalism that he was totally against, because it destroys the spirit, it destroys the imagination. It was coming on board in his time in a kind of Georgian conformity in the Anglican religiosity of his time. And even though Anglicanism has become rather marginal now, this sort of sense that somehow we need a moral creed, and that religion should underpin that, Christianity should underpin that, it's completely anathema to him, because it denies the spirit, it denies the imagination. So when, for example, he reads the Bible, he reads it actually as people had always read the Bible up to the modern period, which was treating it as a text from which the Spirit spoke, not as a kind of blank set of words on a page that somehow you can pin down and get the definitive meaning. And you mentioned the kind of antediluvian Christianity that Blake will talk about there. That's actually very standard in the church fathers. Someone like Augustine will write and say there's only one religion, because religion for them really meant relationship to God, but it takes on many forms because there's many people. And so Christianity is both the one religion and the particular religion we're following now. It can be both and, not either or. And so for Blake, the notion of the Bible, for example, as a text to take your imagination to, in order that the spirit can be released from it. So one obvious example, again, in Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion, there's one little section where he has Mary and Joseph talking, and Mary saying, well, actually, Joseph, I'm not a virgin. I conceived of this child through the normal means. And Joseph at first is absolutely horrified and calls her a whore and everything. And then Mary says, but no, it was love that led me to conceive of this child. And, forgive me, Joseph, and it's because of the same love that I share with you. And then Joseph breaks down and Mary breaks down and they make love in sort of floods of flowing waters and all this. And I think, the reason why Blake could seemingly say that, Mary wasn't a virgin is because he was trying to get to the heart of the matter, which is about love and forgiveness. That's at the heart of the Christian message. And of course, in other places, Blake's quite happy to say Mary was a virgin. He does pictures of Mary and calls her the Virgin and so on. The point is not to try and pin things down and say this is the definitive meaning once and for all. The point is, as you're saying, is to live in a living tradition with different takes that open up the deeper truths. It's a fiction in the best sense. You don't complain when a fiction tells you a whole bunch of lies, when you feel like actually it's revealing deeper truths about human nature. Well, for Blake, the Bible was exactly the same. It was a set of living stories that ideally challenge you moment by moment to break open, to release you from the cavern's mind, as he puts it, to cleanse the doors of perception. And you'll know he writes this very rude letter to a clergyman of the time, Dr. Trussler, and says, I'm so sorry that your mind is so small that you can't see what I'm talking about, but, I'm not going to cast my pearls before swine anymore. But he also goes on to explain a bit more, not just being rude, and saying, the reason why the Bible is this extraordinary book of inspiration that has been around for millennia now is precisely because it releases the imagination. If it was like a telephone directory, just a whole list of facts, it would have died in the first generation. No one will want to read it now. But it's because it operates in this different way. I think the in-between, the imaginative zone, is absolutely fundamental for Blake, and he's constantly inviting us to step into that intermediate world, the contraries, which bridge the finite and the infinite, the mortal and the immortal, the human and the divine. That's absolutely the heart of the human calling. And to come to a conclusion on a rhapsody to Blake, he's saying to us then and he's saying to us now, if we don't embrace that, then we lose our humanity and we destroy the world, I think, in the process. He's absolutely clear about that.
There's a beautiful way of saying what's at stake. I mean, the most delicious irony I find these days is you have all these evangelical Christians saying you need Christianity because of its laws. Stone the whore, you shall not do this, you shall not do that. That's what we have to offer is these laws. And then you have secularists saying, I don't need your laws. Because I have my conscience that speaks to me. And the irony is that is Christianity. That is the Christian idea, is that is the divine within you, that you can apply that. And that opens up this whole other way of seeing Blake and Christianity. But thank you so much, Mark, for joining us today. And as with many of the podcasts, I'm sure you find the same thing. That I think we're just getting going when time's up and stuff like that. But thank you very much, and I'm sure we'll be revisiting some of this discussion in future. I very much hope so. And I'd like to encourage people to do a couple of things. One is obviously to subscribe to the Traveller in the Evening blog. So no matter where you're hearing this podcast, get yourself to thetravellerintheevening.com. travellingevenings1word.com, and subscribe to the newsletter, and you'll hear all news of everything else we're up to here. And the other thing is to recommend Mark's various books and things. As I say, I'm about to throw myself into his Dante brick, and I'm very much looking forward to that. But I'll also mention I know you've been doing podcasts with Rupert Sheldrake, but I think they're regular, aren't they, and ongoing? Are they still going on?
We've actually done 90 dialogues now on all sorts of subjects, including some on Dante, but I know the last one I think was on memory and all sorts of things. A lot of those are around and about.
Yeah, no, I've heard a couple of them. I just want to make sure they're still ongoing because I want to recommend them to people. So again, people, I'll put links to Mark's books and to the series with Rupert Sheldrake in the blog post attached to the podcast. So thank you again, Mark, and thanks everyone for tuning in and listening to us.